deeply grateful to be nominated for this award, and I also am happy to accept it not only on my own behalf, but that of several institutions and people I'll mention throughout the talk and at the end. And I'm also very happy to be talking about ancient globalization in West Mexico. I was drawn to work in West Mexico by something long recognized but very little understood: the formation of pre-Hispanic connections between the urbanized populations of Mesoamerica and the emerging complex societies of to the north, including West Mexico, Northwest Mexico, and the US Southwest. The most profound and earliest of these connections was the introduction of maize agriculture, which reached the US Southwest by circa 2000 BCE. And then over many centuries, as maize economies became entrenched, other material markers of such connections appeared. For example, turquoise, chemically matched to a source in Cerrillos, New Mexico of the United States, found in an archaeological site in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Theobromine caffeine residue of the cacao plant, native to the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica, found in ceramic vessels in Chaco Canyon of New Mexico, United States. Scarlet macaws, native to the same tropical region, found sacrificed and buried in Paquime, Chihuahua, in the far extreme northern Mexico. And copper bells and bronze bells, probably made in West Mexico, found throughout the US Southwest. These and other markers began to appear in notable frequencies around 900 of the Common Era. The emergence of new exchange connections was entwined with the rise of large-scale regional centers in West Mexico, Northwest Mexico, and the US Southwest. The latter two we often call the Northwest Southwest in that part of the world. Each of these regions here, shown here, these subregions, have a center. Some have more. And some archaeologists call these centers cities. I think the term introduced this morning by Dr. Renfrew, congregation center, is highly applicable to these all, whereas city may not be. In any case, these large settlements began to appear around 600 to 900 CE, a millennium after the earliest cities emerged in Mesoamerica proper, and they represent an expansion of Mesoamerican civilization toward the north. The generally increasing appearance of distantly obtained objects in these sites is a kind of globalization. In today's world, globalization is defined as the increasing extension, interpenetration, and interdependence of production systems and networks of flows across national borders. In West Mexico and Northwest Southwest, these are places to examine the fundamental questions posed by urbanization and globalization in their incipient form. Why did centers form? Why did they make such connections? How did life change in the affected places? And how did institutions, especially those of exchange, evolve over time? My students, colleagues, and I have addressed these questions at two geographic scales, the local and the macro-regional. We have achieved perspective on the local scale by conducting fieldwork at a single regional center called La Quemada in Zacatecas, northern Mexico. That to test predictions derived from competing ideas about the processes that drove the northern expansion of Mesoamerican civilization. The competition pits environmental drivers against political economic ones. The fieldwork was authorized by the Mexican government under the title of the La Quemada Malpaso Valley Archaeological Project. Working at one site was productive, but it could not answer questions about the larger picture of exchange. So we began to build a macro-regional perspective by combining data on long-distance exchange from many different regions. This work is primarily archival and bibliographic, mining data site by site for occurrences of long-distance exchange items. We tabulate the items in overarching typologies of form, style, chronology, and context. The data constitute a grid of time, space, and artifact characteristics against which to test hypotheses about the form of the network or networks and how it or they changed over time. This international collaboration is known to its participants as the Connections Project, short for Connections and Impacts of Northwest Mexican Cultures. Studies at La Quemada have used a range of methods from archaeology and related sciences to explore ancient environmental, economic, and social change at the local level. La Quemada is a hilltop fortress and a so-called primate center, many times larger than the other settlements in its orbit. Charles Trumbold has shown that 175 kilometers of pre-Hispanic roads, shown as dotted lines here, connect La Quemada to over 200 tightly clustered villages, subordinate villages in a 120 square kilometer area. Areas beyond this cluster were lightly occupied, suggesting that the road-related settlements constituted an ancient community. Our team first mapped the ceremonial center, added a lot of features to the map, and defined some of the spatial configurations. And for the sake of our being behind and not able to have coffee, I'm going to skip the details about that. The excavations there yielded, the map provided a sampling frame. From that sampling frame, we chose one terrace to excavate, which is a rather average sized terrace outside the main enclosed wall where the central precinct is located. And we excavated this 40 by 80 meter terrace, found around 40 different rooms, one of which was a temple, a number of sunken patios, and several other features, and learned a lot about the configuration of built space in these northern monuments that wasn't known previously. Again, skipping some details. We also excavated 10 trash middens or rubbish middens outside the monumental core of the site, and they're shown here as red dots. Moreover, we excavated off-site trenches to get evidence on environmental change. To see whether climate change played a role in the founding and abandonment of La Quemada, and therefore possibly in the Mesoamerican expansion, we used earth science methods such as palynology, geomorphology, sedimentology, and paleomagnetism to analyze samples from the off-site trenches. We look for changes in environmental indicators belonging to the periods before, during, and after the major occupation of La Quemada. For example, paleomagnetism might reveal an increase in the iron content of sediments, indicating increased erosion. That pattern should be corroborated by botanical evidence of changing land cover. The sediments themselves should change in particle size and angularity. The main finding of these studies was that no evidence of environmental change appeared to be, was detectable in association with the main occupation at La Quemada. If the occupation were associated with improved rainfall, we should see upward inflections in the red lines as they cross the widest gray line, representing the greatest human population. The only red lines that do inflect upward are boreal pollen, which may have increased as a result of decreased grasses, and human population, which is the main occupation itself. Major changes were seen instead in the colonial period, the Spanish colonial period, and beyond, when mining and agriculture led to deforestation. In investigating these human-environmental relationships, we came up with many other questions and designed specific studies to answer them. One that particularly interested me was the development of a mathematical model to help understand the role of agave, or century plant, a succulent, as backup resource when maize failed due to drought. Because agave can store water to feed itself for years, it might have been a key to survival in this relatively arid region. Simulation shows that agave cultivation could have eliminated the need for an astonishing 93% of famine-related migrations. Researchers had also suggested that long-distance exchange was a stimulus to the formation of La Quemada. Specifically, Phil Wigand argued that the site was a station on a turquoise trail connecting Tula, the black dot to the south, with Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, in the United States. The latter being a place where a lot of turquoise has been found. This suggestion actually brought me to La Quemada because, trained as a U.S. Southwest archaeologist, I was intrigued by the chance to find tangible evidence of such a connection. Just how common was turquoise as a raw material and as finished objects in the local setting at La Quemada? We were unable to confirm the intermediary relationship with evidence from excavation. For one thing, La Quemada turns out to be earlier. We dated La Quemada and found out that it's a lot earlier than either Tula or Chaco Canyon. They are both occupied from the late 800s to mid 1100s, whereas La Quemada is earlier, from 600 to about 800, 850 CE. La Quemada also turns out to have very little turquoise. We found fewer than 50 blue-green stones, only a third of which were turquoise, according to geochemist Alison Thibodeau. If worked into beads, this quantity of turquoise would not make a necklace. In fact, only a few pieces were worked, notably including one tessera characteristic of Mesoamerican mosaics. Thus, our excavation did not confirm the idea of La Quemada as an outpost on a turquoise trail from the US Southwest to central Mexico. This small number of turquoise pieces contrasts interestingly with the high frequencies of from Alta Vista, about 17,000 of which were documented by J. Charles Kelly and Phil Wigand. The La Quemada data show that even contemporary sites, such as these two circled, that were quite closely related culturally, did not necessarily have the same degree of participation in the excavation, in the participation in the exchange networks. Items that were common in other sites were rare at La Quemada. And I'm going to forego mentioning those also because I'm making up not only for my time, but some other, I think. Also, what would be really good to be able to discuss is one of the hallmarks of La Quemada, the massive deposits of human bones, which are mostly not burials, but various kinds of displays and discards. And I'll not mention the details of that. But except that Ventura Perez and Deborah Martin, bioarchaeologists, identified two distinct patterns of cut marks. See the lower right there, bone with cut marks. There seemed to have been one pattern associated with people who were treated as if they were enemies, and another who were treated as if they were revered ancestors. Okay. Why was La Quemada's participation in long-distance exchange so limited? While other sites had phenomenal quantities of distantly obtained items, for example, the tens of thousands of turquoise pieces on Aztec mosaics, such as the one shown here, or the hundreds of macaws and copper bells at Paquime in Chihuahua. To find out, we have initiated the macro-regional exchange study. The Connections Project has been attacking the question of long-distance exchange by gathering and analyzing data about exchange objects from hundreds of pre-Hispanic settlements from central Mexico to the U.S. Southwest. Our questions concern the evolution of macro-regional exchange relations. It is well known that by Aztec times, far-reaching systems of taxation and commerce were in place, conforming to a model of expansionary peripheral expansion. Is Aztec mercantilism an appropriate model for the earlier periods? And do Northwest Mexican changes in participation reveal when commercialized market exchange became a part of the world system of Mesoamerica and affected these regions? Defining the spatial and temporal distribution of evidence for exchange should help archaeologists answer such general questions. For example, the Aztec model predicts a single set of relations coordinating flows of goods and information into a single marketplace. Alternatively, there could have been flows alternatively, there could have been different sets of relations among centers of production and acquisition, independent acquisition as well. And we wanted to know whether all Northwest Mexican centers were intermediaries in these interactions. We knew from the very first sites that archaeologists chose to excavate in the region starting in the 1950s that there were sites that had abundant turquoise, shell, copper, and other exchange items, yet no one has looked at the exchange data in the aggregate to assess the extent of shared participation by West and Northwest Mexican centers. The Connections Project, of which Jose Luis Punzo and I are co-directors, is still in early stages, but has made several important findings. One, the networks did not involve all sites in the region. During any given time period, only certain sites were involved. Not all regional centers contain all kinds of objects. In many instances, there were very large spatial gaps in the occurrence of specific interaction markers. Not all West Mexican or Northwest Mexican sites were intermediaries. I would like to just show you very quickly this tabulation from several Northwest Mexican centers, which demonstrates that many centers appear not to be participating in long distance exchange, or if they are, only in one or two materials. Combining intensive site study with the extensive interregional data collection permits a perspective on the problem of ancient globalization. La Quemada's limited participation in interregional exchange suggests variable West Mexican and Northwest Mexican participation, and additional data from other sites confirms this. Indeed, participation at the level manifested in sites that we know about was unusual. It may be that at any one time only a select few sites were highly active in acquiring distant objects. Incorporating this perspective, the answer to why La Quemada's participation was limited is relatively simple. Most sites in West Mexico and Northwest Mexico were not highly involved in long-distance exchange, and moreover, La Quemada was occupied and abandoned before the level of macro-regional exchange reached its peak. The data from later sites shows much more evidence of active exchange, and that's when we begin to see abundant macaws, copper shell, etc., in single sites such as Paquimé. In sum, our research strategy allows us to characterize the presence of the distant in the local in these regions. Such presence existed in ancient Mesoamerica proper from 1200 BCE, extending into West Mexico by the early centuries CE, and then the instances of distance, even then the instances of distantly obtained objects are too few and scattered to support an idea of commercialization. Even after 1200 CE of the Common Era, it's unclear whether foreigners were directly intervening in the Northwest-Southwest to acquire resources, or whether the Northwest-Southwest peoples were traveling great distances to acquire exotic objects. Many questions remain to be answered, but it's clear that the degree of globalization was uneven, always changing, and mediated by local custom and practice. I conclude with this sketch representing the occurrence of selected markers of interaction in comparison to their source areas. Separate distribution means different distributions of time and space for several items, suggesting non-pervasiveness and the existence of several distinct networks. We note non-reciprocity between the regions and a lack of evidence for direct exchange in Mesoamerica prior to 1350 CE, almost 5 centuries after Mesoamerican items became common in the north. Turquoise is the only material that comes from northern sources, and turquoise artifacts are rare in major Mesoamerican centers predating 1350 CE and not common then. For now, we conclude that although interpenetration and interdependence began to affect northern centers circa 900 CE, there's little evidence for mutuality until late pre-Hispanic times, and even then, there were large spatial gaps in the occurrence of many items, implying variable integration of the areas in the northwest, southwest. And very briefly, I want to show some of the folks, the institutions and people who've been instrumental in reaching a lot of these conclusions. Thank you all very much for listening.
谢谢田西教授。